Thank you very much, Yuki. I'm Michael Peel. I'm the executive editor of Nikkei Asia. Welcome everybody to our webinar on the impact of the recent US midterm elections on Asia. It's great to have you all with us today online, and please do send in your questions for our excellent panelists, and we'll try to get through as many of those as possible. The midterms, of course, the results are still unclear, still being pored over. It's clear that the Republican Party seems to have made some gains in the House of Representatives, but many races are still too close to call. And US political experts will pore over those in the coming days. But we are interested in the very specific and important point of what do these elections mean for Asia? And we're lucky to have three Nikkei Asia journalists with varying and excellent expertise to discuss different dimensions of this today. And we have, in no particular order, Ken Moriyasu, who is based in Tokyo and is diplomatic correspondent for Nikkei Asia, covers diplomacy and security. Welcome, Ken. Thank you for joining us. And then next to him, on my screen anyway, is Jack Truitt, who is a business correspondent for Nikkei Asia, based in New York. Hello, Jack, and thank you very much for joining us pretty late on in the New York day. And next we have Yifan Yu, and Yifan is technology correspondent for Nikkei Asia, based in Silicon Valley, and obviously at the sharp end of a lot of trans-Pacific tech stories and controversies, indeed, that have been unfolding over the past few years. Yifan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So to kick off, without further ado, and please do put your questions, as I say, in the chat box at any time, and we'll go through the most interesting ones and the ones we have time for. I mean, perhaps. Ken, if I could come to you first, because as we were just discussing, we have the midterm results, and then immediately we go into this series of summits in Asia, which Joe Biden will attend, at least some of them, and at one, the G20 in Indonesia. He is expected, it was announced yesterday, to meet with China's President Xi Jinping, which will be a very big moment. Tell us how you see those summits now, especially in the context of the results we've seen this week, and Biden perhaps being a little more buoyant than one might have expected.
Yeah, exactly. I think both leaders will be coming into Bali, Indonesia, feeling pretty good. Xi Jinping will be feeling very good because he's won his third term and he's filled his cabinet with allies only. It's a dissent-free cabinet. So he has a pretty free hand to do what he wants. Biden dodged the bullet of the red wave, and it could have been much worse for him, but he's coming feeling better than expected. So they'll be on a good footing. And this summit is going to be very important. It has been 11 years in the making because in January 2011, when then Chinese President Hu Jintao visited the White House, he and President Obama agreed and put in the joint statement that their respective vice presidents, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, should meet, and that Biden should first go to China, and then Xi Jinping would make a reciprocal visit to Washington. And that was January, and the Biden visit took place in August. And this was a 6-day trip, a whopping 6-day trip in China, in which Biden and Xi met for 5 times, 5 meetings. These meetings included official meetings, dinners, a visit to a high school, and also an official, no necktie, casual dinner at the very end, which could have been the most important. And the idea was to have these two leaders meet. For Washington, they wanted Biden to have had more experience meeting Xi than any other leader in the world. And 11 years later, I think Biden still is the person outside of China who has met and spent the most time with Xi Jinping. They would come with a clean slate, as you would say. They would try to establish the boundaries or the future path for US-China relations. For the past 11 years, the US and China have not been able to find a comfortable middle ground where they can both exist. So I think this will be a very interesting starting point for the two sides. We received a question in the chat box. How do you view the results of the midterm elections and the impact on US-Taiwan relations? Taiwan will definitely be a main topic here, but I think it's important. I think Xi Jinping will explain what he wants to do in his third term. And it's not going to be an invasion of Taiwan, but it's going to be to focus on common prosperity and to get his version, a Chinese-style economy in place. And he doesn't want any distraction for that. And Taiwan would definitely be the biggest distraction if there are more moves from the US side. So I think that's what Xi Jinping will say. And Biden will say that, okay, let's stick to the three communiques. The three communiques does acknowledge the Chinese position that there is only one China, but the minute China takes aggressive actions to try to invade Taiwan, for instance, the three communiques goes out the window. So I think they would discuss, these will be some of the crucial points that they'll be talking about.
Thanks, Ken. And that's a great reminder that the fact that Joe Biden was vice president for 8 years gives him a history on the world stage, which is actually immensely important sort of background to understanding how he interacts with other leaders as president today. If I could turn to you, Ifan, obviously the US-China relationship, as Ken mentioned, has been getting worse and worse. And one of the big dimensions of that has been the tech war that has started increasing US restrictions on companies doing business with major Chinese companies. What can we say about, do you think, about what the midterms might mean for that, the sort of the new balance of power that seems to be emerging in Congress, and also perhaps if you could also comment on the importance of these summits, which we've just been discussing in Asia for those tech tensions, and how things might develop from there.
Sure. I think the past 2 years, I really witnessed the sentiment in Silicon Valley and also tech sector participants in China, how the sentiment has changed entirely during the past 2 years. I remember back in late 2020 and early 2021, before Biden was elected and when he was first elected, like the Silicon Valley and a lot of tech executives in China are very, very optimistic. Like they know the honeymoon phase between US-China is long over, but they still have hope that the new presidency gonna slow down the tech decoupling in some way. But obviously the past 2 years has proven wrong in many ways. And a lot of people I talked to 2 years ago, now I go back to them, they have become a lot more pessimistic. And for this particular midterm, I think one thing on their mind is not like, okay, US-China relations, and in particular, the tech sector gonna have a better relations coming after midterm. They know like they're gonna be more China-related sanctions. They know they're gonna be more tensions in terms of US-China technology competitions. They just accept it as a reality now. And what those companies are asking for, from an American company perspective, they are asking for any relief they can get from Washington. For example, earlier this year, the passage of CHIPS Act is a huge step taken by the federal government to basically help American companies to reduce some reliance on the Asian supply chain. And with American tech company not accept that China may not become a close technology partner in the future, they are trying to make backup supply chain and move away from China, namely Apple, Microsoft, and many others. So they are really looking for government subsidy and help to help them do that and reduce a lot of the higher costs because of the supply chain shift. You know, it's not the easiest year for the tech sector. They have a lot to dealing with, you know, the Ukraine war, the inflation, you know, the strong US dollar actually caused a lot of margin headwinds on American big tech. So they're really hoping after the midterm, the government can lend in a helping hand for them to basically transition from the tough macro environment and to adjust to the new reality between US and China. And for Chinese company, a lot of tech executives I talk to, one thing they are really hoping for is constructive conversations between Washington and Beijing. Like they just want the two leadership to sit down, like the conversation Ken described earlier, like a face-to-face conversation, constructive conversation that makes normalize the trade relationship. There's like, they know it's not going to be like a huge improvement from the sanctions we are seeing today, but they hope they can be some constructive conversations between Biden and Xi that gives them some leeways to move around the two governments without being hit by sanction one day after another. For the Bali summit, I think one issue Ken already mentioned, Taiwan, that's going to be a huge part of the conversation, and tech sectors are watching very closely because, as we all know, Taiwan pretty much control the production of semiconductors. And one thing the Biden administration has been hampered on is the US need to be independent, or at least reduce some reliance on Taiwan because of the concerns that China might take over Taiwan one day. I think that conversation might become part of the Biden-Xi summit meeting. And I think, but regardless of the outcome of the conversation between Biden and Xi, I think the US government is on the way to become more independent in semiconductor supply chain. They're going to be more bills, just like CHIPS Act, that help the US to build its own supply chain, in particular in the advanced technology like semiconductors.
Thanks, Yvonne. And as you suggest, that the language on tech will be one of the things that people will be really watching for out of these summits. And if I could move to you, Jack, I mean, there's a nice segue here. I think that another dimension of the tensions has been on other trade and finance, and we've had this sort of interesting situation where the US has imposed various sanctions, including on Chinese companies with alleged military links. But as you and other colleagues have written, they've just beneath the surface, beneath the sort of harsh rhetoric, there are ways in which those policies are not always enforced as strongly as the top line statements might suggest. And what's your take on, in the context of what we've just seen, the likely new attitude of the likely attitude of the new Congress to China, that what this means for some of the kind of financial aspects of the US-China tensions?
Right. So very broadly speaking, Wall Street tends to enjoy divided Congress because it means there's less likelihood of kind of major legislation, whether it's a lot more spending, a lot more big tax cuts that can disrupt the market one way or the other. But one theme that I think we'll get back to again and again today is that one of the very few things that both parties are kind of swimming in the same direction on is anti-Chinese sentiment. And now, so regarding specifically the implication of that for U.S.-Chinese financial ties, I think one very interesting area to keep an eye on is looks like the Republicans will most likely have a, if narrow, majority in the House, and they'll be led by Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who himself has pledged a committee to investigate China on everything from COVID's origins to economic threats Beijing poses to the U.S. And now it would not be, I think, terribly surprising if this new GOP-led House would kind of try and pass legislation or otherwise establish an outbound investment review committee, which would be a federal entity in the U.S. that reviews investment from the United States to another country under the guise of national security and safeguarding supply chains. And now, obviously, investments connected to China being both a leading trade partner and a key strategic adversary would be probably the most affected of those investments. And this kind of outbound investment review committee has been discussed by Biden's administration themselves already. Nothing has come of it, but it's also on their radar. And under Biden, that inbound foreign investment reviews, which the U.S. already has a committee and a process for, those reviews have gotten a bit more scrupulous, especially relating to China and tech sectors like semiconductors. So I think establishing that kind of outbound investment review process would be an especially fertile ground for a divided Congress, particularly if it's the GOP-controlled House and a Democratic-controlled Senate, where the GOP House is probably trying to would make more waves, I think, in terms of the leaders there than the Republican members of the Senate. And they, along with that House, with the Democratic-led Senate that is similarly skeptical of China, I think it'd be a very fertile area for them to actually get some bipartisan legislation passed, establishing this kind of outbound investment committee. Should that happen, I think at the very least, it would cause a lot of headaches for Wall Street, would significantly slow down American investment into China and Chinese-related entities. Now, of course, it could be a very elegantly constructed committee that only somehow, gets a few investments here and there flagged for review. But I think the odds are it would be a much more sweeping process that would really grind a lot of investment from Wall Street into China to a serious halt.
You make a very interesting point there about how a divided Congress increases the focus perhaps on pushing through legislation on which there is general agreement, and that this could be a consequence of that. Ken, if I could turn back to you, you've spent a very interesting few days in the past week with regional naval commanders, and indeed visiting commanders from other countries as well. Did you tell us a little bit about that, and whether you got the sense that people were seeing the midterms as a particularly formative moment in the sort of US security footprint in Asia, and what else was on their minds regarding US security policy in Asia?
Right. So on Tuesday, I visited Yokohama, where a British warship is visiting. The UK last year announced the integrated review, its national security policy, which launched a tilt, TILT, tilt to the Indo-Pacific. And it pledged to forward deploy 2 warships to the Indo-Pacific for a 5-year term, which is very long. And this was one of the ships on a 5-year term in the Indo-Pacific. What's really striking is that these 2 ships are not going to return to Britain once during these 5 years. And one of the crew was telling me that it might be longer than 5 years, and the ship might finish its career entirely in the Pacific. And what they will do is they will rotate the crew in and out of these ships. And these are not nuclear-powered ships. They run on diesel. So it's a lot of fuel costs. It's a lot of costs to bring in the crew. There's 3 white, blue, and red teams. They rotate, and they have to pay. This was in a Mitsubishi Heavy Industries port for maintenance, but each time they go to one of these docks, they have to pay for the repairs and for the use of the dock. So overall, it's a significant cost. But the first Sea Lord who I interviewed said, this is the future for Britain. The Indo-Pacific is the economic engine, and they absolutely need to be here. And he didn't say so in so many words, but the strategic threat is here, so that's why they need to be here. So the UK has really identified China, the rise of China, as a challenge, and that they are willing to spend all this money to be here. I think in the navies, there is a realization that the modernization of the Chinese military is stunning, and that they fear that if they're not prepared, they won't be able to counter it. And once they allow, for instance, an invasion of Taiwan, and they can't reverse it, that would be the beginning of a really historic shift in international order. So they think this is the crucial moment for this. I think this is a misunderstanding of Chinese policy, but it is the job of military officials to prepare all options for policymakers. So yeah, to answer your question, I think there is also in Japan, there's this huge push to double its defense budget and prepare all these new assets to prepare for the China threat. So there is really heightened tensions in the region.
Yes, and how do people see the American position? I mean, obviously, Biden has now several times, suggested that the U.S. would defend Taiwan in some way, again, is on the security side. Do people see the kind of bipartisan approach that we've talked about with respect to financial sanctions as also being true on the security side, that there is a pretty sort of solid support in Congress also for the US maintaining or even increasing its security footprint in Asia?
Yes, there's totally bipartisan support in terms of being ready for a rising China. I think one takeaway from the midterms is that people seem to agree that former President Donald Trump suffered a blow, and that Trumpism or his influence may go down, and that the Florida governor Ron DeSantis was the biggest winner here. So I think the interesting thing is, if Trump is now not going to run, hypothetically, then who else will be DeSantis's competitor? And DeSantis has a very strong record as a governor. He's popular. He's good on media. What is his weak point? And I think that's very clear. It's foreign policy. So any rival to DeSantis will be a foreign policy expert. That might point to Mike Pompeo. So or Mike Pence, but Mike Pence doesn't seem to be gaining much momentum. So it might be Mike Pompeo. And if Mike Pompeo is the candidate to go against DeSantis, then that would have a big impact on China policy, because he's very anti-China.
Yes, thank you, Ken. And of course, I mean, one of the striking things about this whole question is the way that security policy is very linked to economic policy, as we've already talked about with the supply of tech. And Ifan, I'd like to come to you to ask a bit more about this. There's a very interesting question from Sayomi online saying, how would the Taiwan conflict between the US and China affect Indonesia in terms of microchip consumption? And that I'd like to blend that with a question that I was planning to ask you, which is on the same theme, which is clearly in these summits there will be many other Asian countries who will also have views on US policy in the region, and their own sort of concerns about the congressional approach on tech and other matters. And what do you think? What do you think the fallout is in Asia? What's your sense of what other Asian countries other than China feel about the US tech action, and are they nervous that this is actually going to end up hurting everybody, or do they take a different view?
Right. It's not an Indonesia problem. It's not a Vietnam problem. It's everyone's problem, right? Because like I mentioned, Taiwan basically controls the microchip production for everyone. And the US, obviously, it has the resources, it has the money to prepare for the worst case scenario. They're putting out this like $280 billion bill just to build a supply chain they can rely on in the worst case when, China takes over Taiwan. But for a lot of countries, it's not a very affordable option for them. And they don't have the resources, they don't have the talent, they don't have the ability to be prepared for the war kind of scenario. So I think for this summit, Taiwan issue is not just something between US, China, it's an issue between all countries. Like all countries going to pay a very close attention to China's Taiwan policy. And like Ken mentioned, I don't think like invading Taiwan is in Xi's plan book in the near term, even though it's like being used in the US quite a lot, especially during the passage of CHIPS Act. I think the scenario of China invading Taiwan is a huge reason why these very expensive bill got passed and even get a very strong bipartisan support in the first place. But in reality, that may not happen in the near term, and every Asian countries, every country in the world will pay very close attention to how China actually plans to deal with Taiwan? And what's like, as Biden say, the U.S. also have a red line they want to draw in terms of Taiwan. Like, what kind of protection the U.S. is willing to provide to Taiwan? That's two issues I think Indonesia and all the countries' leaders are watching during the summit.
This is a really, really important point. And I mean, the whole question of how sort of companies react to this as well is also crucial. And Jack, you touched on this earlier. I mean, clearly, as we've discussed, there's been a certain amount of kind of nuance in some of the sanction regulations that have come forth. Do you expect, once the dust has settled from these midterms, that this will continue to be the pattern, that companies will lobby for opt-outs, carve-outs, or rules being enforced over a longer timescale, sanctions sort of related to China-related finance? I mean, do you see that pattern continuing, or do you get a sense that there might be a change in the dynamic, either on the company level or the government level?
Right. I do think that that will certainly continue. The recent export controls, which we've covered quite a bit on Chinese tech sector, really limiting the Chinese chip industry. It's currently in its review period where companies get basically to put in comments and give their feedback on this these export controls that the White House and the federal government has laid out. And even before that comment period has ended, in which case it almost always ends with companies submitting their replies, and then eventually the administration kind of waters down a little bit some of the controls and kind of acquiesces a little bit to what the companies ask. Even before that has happened, the White House is kind of, or the Bureau of Industry and Security has come out and kind of not necessarily walked back, but kind of watered down a little bit some of these export control languages. They chose not to outright ban all applications from these entities on the list, but they rather a presumption of denial, which is a bit not quite as harsh as they could have been with the full-on ban for 1 or 2 years. And so I think you're already seeing some of that before the companies even themselves have their say. And so I think there's certainly going to be a continued pattern of there's probably too much money at stake for these companies not to kind of have at least some sway, some influence, and kind of do what they can to give the tug and pull of the political game of carving out some exceptions and some wiggle room for all that money that is flowing from the U.S. to not just China, but I mean so many China-related entities in such an interconnected world, especially in the technology sector.
Thanks, Jack. And I do. We're about halfway through now, and please do, as I mentioned at the start, do send in your questions on the chat channel. This is a great chance to ask our eminent panel whatever you like. And there's another interesting one on right now, actually, which is this: would lower U.S. reliance on Taiwan for tech mean it's easier for China to take Taiwan? Ken?
This is very interesting. This is like, it's called the tripwire logic. And the same rationale goes for the US bases in Japan. There are 55,000 American troops in Japan, and any attack from an adversary to Japan would put these American troops at risk. So therefore, America would definitely 100% join the war to protect Japan. So this is the tripwire thing. But this question is similar to that. Would the American reliance on Taiwan kind of immediately trigger a US response? But if America is self-sufficient and doesn't rely on Taiwan, would America lose interest? Of course, America would not say that, but it might be very true. I think it's a very interesting point. I haven't answered the question, but I think it's an interesting question. Yifan, do you have comments?
I actually disagree, because even though, like, by reliance, it's all it's a two-way street, right? Taiwan obviously, the US obviously relies on Taiwan for TSMC's manufacturing capability, but actually TSMC relies on the US for its chip making equipment and a lot of the resources, like talents. So I don't think there is a scenario like China gonna take over Taiwan and then it just controls and take over all the advanced chip manufacturing technology immediately. Because even though it has controls of Taiwan, it doesn't have the control over the American equipment suppliers. It doesn't have the supply of all those materials they need. So it's actually like a lose-lose scenario if they do take over Taiwan. So I don't think like US trying to build its supply chain, semiconductor supply chain is reducing the technology exchanges between Taiwan and the US that much, because even though Taiwan manufacturing all the chips, they still need a lot of equipment from the US. So I think the intertwined link is not going to be broken or weakened just because the US are building its own supply chain. But obviously, like I mentioned, US is preparing for the worst case scenario, and so it's a legit question to ask.
Yes, and perhaps there's an interesting question related to that, which is, of course, it could have an impact on China itself, because China itself is to some extent dependent on Taiwan. And is that part of the sort of reason why both of you, Ifan and Ken, you both kind of discount the idea of an invasion soon, that there would be consequences, economic consequences in terms of semiconductor supply for China itself?
No, I think what Xi is trying to do is like he sees his predecessors, Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, as being weak leaders who dipped their toes in the market economy, but because they didn't really have a strong grip on the direction of the country, that they really just accelerated inequalities. And that the reality today is that there is a class of very rich people, mostly second generation, third generation of former leaders, who enjoy a wonderful life, and where Ifan is based, many Chinese rich kids driving Lamborghinis. Whereas back in China, there's a huge middle class that even if they work hard, they won't be able to buy apartments, because the average price of an apartment condominium in Beijing is 38 times annual salary or something like that. So I think he believes that now is the time for a strong leader to implement what he calls common prosperity, and to divide the cake. And only through that, only when the middle class knows that it will be rewarded for working hard, only in such a scenario will China regain its engine, the growth engine. And that will be the only way to compete with the US, because if we go down this Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin path, there'll be so much inequality, so much corruption, and that these rich kids really don't contribute to the economy whatsoever. I think that's what he's thinking. So that's what I think that's why he thinks that the path is clear, and that he needs a cabinet that will execute this plan. He doesn't want a cabinet in which people debate whether this path is correct or not. So I think that is the main reason of what he's doing. And of course, if Taiwan declares independence, he would have to act. And of course, there will be clashes. But other than that, I agree with Ifan. I don't see Xi Jinping waking up and say, right, today is the day I want to take Taiwan because it feels good. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, if common prosperity, if dividing the cake is his main priority to maintain China's strength, then a draining Taiwan invasion, he's watching what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. It's not really helping Russia's economy at all. So I think that's a scenario he wants to avoid, not to pursue.
I think, put it in simple terms, China can't afford to really invade Taiwan or really piss US off. Like this is evidenced by what China has actually been doing in the past 3 years. Like the US-China trade tension or the tech sanction is not new. Like it's since 2019, the Huawei sanctions. Basically, US has done a lot of like real damages to the US to China's most advanced technology sector. But obviously, Beijing put out a lot of harsh words like, okay, this is bullying. The US is a big bully. We're gonna do a lot of this and that to counterattack. But if you look at what China and Beijing has done in the past years, it's actually nothing. It didn't sanction any American companies. It didn't kick like Intel or like Global Foundries out. It's actually like at this point, all they can afford is like saying these harsh words, but they can actually not, like they can't do much about offend and kick out and sanction American high-tech companies at this point. So, and they can't really just like take over Taiwan and try to build its own semiconductor supply chain. And that's why based on, and all these things happened before she consolidated his third terms, right? So even, so he didn't do anything drastic before he's confirmed for the third term. I don't think he's gonna do anything drastic after he already consolidated his power.
These are very interesting observations, and I mean to sort of shift the question around as well. I mean, we talked about consequences for China. There's a question online from John who says, which areas do you think the US and China would have a mutual interest in cooperating on to ease tensions and build trust? And do you think those areas would be discussed in the summit on Monday? Now, obviously, that's quite hard to predict, but perhaps, I mean, Jack, if I could sort of turn to you on this, whether you think that from people you speak to in finance, whether there is a sense that there might be a different approach possible, are companies lobbying for a different approach, and if so, what might that look like in practice? Something more cooperative that allows companies to do business in China but doesn't cross the red line set by the White House or Congress?
Well, it's hard to say what kind of direct dialogue in that vein would come up in their meeting. Of course, we've seen now recent a longstanding issue was the kind of accounting authority and regulation and insight into Chinese companies listed in the U.S. And after many months of kind of give and take, they finally seem to have reached a deal allowing American auditing teams to inspect the books of these Chinese companies. That's currently ongoing. And that was a big step forward in that relationship between the private sector of the US and China. Now, maybe it's the opposite of the question in terms of that's maybe not less of an area of room for progress as it is a possible carrot to take away. It's something that has been made progress to remove or cause issues for once again. I don't think there's necessarily any signs that will happen at the moment, but there are progress like that can be taken away as a form of leverage as well. And I'm curious as far as the cooperation aspect is. I think a big risk that the U.S. faces after these midterms politically is that, for example, a very obvious area that the two countries can cooperate would be something like climate change, where there should be, it's a relatively politically neutral in theory area. The U.S. and China are leading emitters. And one risk that an oppositional Congress like we see now could have is maybe in an attempt to look strong and to kind of weaken Biden's footing, the Republican House could maybe kind of withhold legislation or use what power they have to maybe criticize Biden officials for engaging in dialogues on things that aren't even kind of strategically competitive, like climate change or energy or other kind of more, or global health rather. That are should be more politically neutral, but could become kind of a tool for political rabble rousing within the U.S.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. That's a very good insight. And there are many more sort of security questions here, which perhaps we can come back to in a second. But I just wanted to just sort of drag things back to a kind of counterfactual about the midterms, that one of the themes has been that this was a bad night for Donald Trump, and that probably it has decreased his chances of getting the Republican nomination and the presidency back? I mean, obviously, one must be wary about making very firm predictions on this, but that does seem to be a general consensus at the moment, that it's strengthened the position potentially of Ron DeSantis as a potential Republican nominee. Now, it's very early days, but how much do you think that the possibility of a second Trump presidency has sort of figured in the way that the way that Asian countries and companies look at the US in the region, and is there likely to be maybe a bit of recalibration that people will be thinking maybe it's less likely that we're going to get Trump back, so and then we might have a Republican White House with a different style and a different agenda? A tough question, I know, but who would like to take that one? Ken, you're usually game for these kind of counterfactuals.
Right. For companies, I'll leave that to Jack. But I think if I could just answer from what I think Beijing would think, I think Biden is very good for China because he's very predictable. His path is to unite allies and to frame the competition as democracies versus autocracies. This is fine because China can prepare for it and act accordingly. They are not ready for Trump because Trump they cannot plan for. A very good example is when Trump reached out to North Korea's Kim Jong-un. Until then, Xi Jinping really didn't care for North Korea. He never met him for many years. But as soon as he heard that Trump was willing to meet Kim Jong-un, then hurriedly, Xi Jinping invited Kim Jong-un to China. And they really exposed how much North Korea could be used as a card against China, and it kind of exposed China's weakness on that. So I think Beijing will be very worried about Trump. So I didn't answer your question.
Yes, I mean, it's an interesting point about sort of predictability that you make there. I suppose the counterpoint might be that, excuse me, Trump is obviously impressed by authoritarian leaders, including Xi, and that whether Xi might feel that he can be exploited in that sense, because he does seem rather enthralled to the ideas of leaders who have sort of near absolute power. But perhaps the unpredictability is more important than that. It's all guesswork, of course, but it's I think there may be a bit of recalibration sort of in the region, that perhaps if a Trump presidency is a little bit less likely or seen as such, then people are perhaps going to be sort of reviewing their strategies. Unless anyone else wants to come in on that one, I wanted to move to another sort of question very specifically about the midterms, that clearly we've written, our colleague Marianne Zhou particularly has written about some prejudice against Asian Americans during these elections, and that this has come up directly in some races, where some congressional races where candidates have been portrayed as pro-China, and that this is a rather sort of disturbing development. And I wanted to ask how it looked like from the ground, how sort of how much this is sort of disfiguring the debate, i.e., political questions about the US-China relationship turning into bigotry, and also whether there's an early sense of how different groups of Asian Americans, which of course is a vast and very heterogeneous group of millions of people around the country, how people from different communities of Asian Americans actually voted in the midterms.
I can talk about that. So I think in this midterm, like foreign policy, as we all know, doesn't always come into the become a midterm election issue. But this year, because of all the domestic issues like gun control, abortion rights, inflation, and like the economy going off rail, like the Republican and Democrats, they need a punching bag, and China is that punching bag everyone can punch on. And the side effect is that like Asian Americans, like Chinese American in particular, has become like are now dealing with the increasing rate of hate crime in the country, because people always confuse China and like Chinese Communist Party and equals them to Asian American in living in the US. I think that's a real side effect that we're going to see more and more as we lead up to the 2024 presidential election. No matter whether it's Trump going to go seek re-election or it's going to be another candidate, it's this China, like this imaginary or the real enemy of the United States, going to cause more like rhetoric about anti-China and the great rivalry between the US and China. And as a consequences, Asian Americans going to face this more discrimination and hate crime in the country. And because of the fear of that, I think the turnout of Asian American voters in this midterm has increased by quite a lot. Because like people knows if it's going to be a Republican control, especially those China hawks, like namely, you know, Marco Rubio, you know, Tom Holland, they got reelected, and all these both aisles are controlled by the Republican county, especially controlled by China hawks. The time for Asian American living in the US is going to be tougher and tougher.
Well, yes, and this is a very, very, very disturbing trend, and is this something that people are taking seriously? I mean, you know, this sense of our top political leaders taking their responsibilities, I suppose, which is to say, look, let's distinguish, you know, political disputes with other countries from bigotry against people who may have heritage from those countries. I mean, Jack, I mean, from where you're sitting, I mean, how does it look in New York? I mean, is this something that sort of comes up a lot? Obviously, New York traditionally quite a liberal place in many ways. Is this something that's sort of concerning people and people are trying to do something about?
Yeah, I think it's certainly been a big story here since the start of the pandemic, really, with you know, Chinatown seeing much less foot traffic at the start, and that community dealing with some of the earliest pains of COVID, and there's been some you know, horrifying attacks throughout the city, and I think it's been a really contentious issue in the U.S. You know, particularly in regards to a lot of I think in recent years, kind of Asian American struggles and kind of tensions within that community have kind of come to the fray in terms of, you know, there's an ongoing Supreme Court case regarding affirmative action and that concerns Asian Americans in places like Harvard and I believe it's California University's the other one, but I'm not quite sure. So it is coming up quite a bit, and currently they are voting according to an Asian American Pacific Islander voting organization that was conducting a survey. They do still lean quite Democratic in general, but I think a major trend that people are trying to contend with is that you know, a lot of groups like Asian Americans, like Latinos, like African Americans have always tended to, for a long time at least, have tended to vote Democratic and have been kind of reliably Democratic in voting, and that has shifted since 2018 quite a bit. It's unclear this election quite the numbers. We don't have the data yet, but I think the hunch would be that will continue, and so it's something that I think politicians will do a lot of lip service towards, but it doesn't seem to be winning over the voters. I think they really are going to have to show more action because those votes can't really be taken for granted anymore from one party to the other. And so in a sense, that should also make those voting blocks like Asian Americans, which are, I believe, one of the fastest growing groups over the last 20 years, have more political power within the US as their voice becomes more listened to.
This will be a very important and interesting trend to follow. Thank you both. And now going back to the security questions, which are obviously understandably on a lot of people's minds, there are a couple here which I'd like to touch on. One is from from Taiwan, actually, where the question is this. Both Ken and Ifan have said they believe an invasion of Taiwan is not in Xi Jinping's plans. Here in Taiwan, however, the increasing military activity by the PLA on a nearly regular basis, such as during the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's August visit, indicates otherwise, or at least suggests some sort of a blockade of the island might be likely. And what evidence do Ken and Ifan have that indicates such an attack by China should be discounted nearly completely? Now, we have talked a little bit about this already, obviously, and some of the reasons why an invasion might be damaging to China's own interests, or at least perceived in Beijing as so. But Ken, you wanted to add something to this, I think.
Yeah, the Nancy Pelosi visit, how to analyze, what's the takeaway from that? I think is a very important question. Was China's response massive, or was it underwhelming? And I think it was underwhelming because until the lead up to the visit, Chinese hawkish commentators were saying we're going to shoot down the plane, or we're going to at least block it from landing. And I think there was expectation in China that maybe a Chinese fighter jet would intercept it and maybe move the plane to force it to land in South Korea or Tokyo or Okinawa. That would have been cheered in China. We were watching, everyone was watching the flight, and nothing happened. And only the Chinese side announced so-called massive drills, but only after Pelosi left. So from Pelosi's standpoint, nothing really happened. And I think this is very symbolic of China's strategy here. I talked to a Chinese professor here. He said that the Chinese see America as a land of lawyers, and that once these lawyers understand that China has the upper hand militarily, then they will find a way to compromise. So the strategy is to make sure that China has military superiority, and then without fighting, win without fighting is the main strategy. Like Ifan said, it's too expensive, and the risks are too high compared to what anything Xi Jinping can gain. And even if they manage to win the day one of the battle, they're going to have to sustain the occupation, which is going to be very draining and very expensive. And I don't see any merit for that.
Thanks, Ken. Ifan, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Right. I just think there is a long old saying in Chinese foreign policy is called "wait and bide your time." Like China would not move to do something drastically until, like Ken say, it's making sure it has the upper hand. I think at this point, because even though China has been bragging about its technology advancement in the past 10 years during Xi's term, it's not on par with the US yet. It's working hard on that, but it still needs time. So it's waiting and by its time. That's why we are saying in the near term, we don't see that's a likely scenario that's gonna work to China's benefit in terms of Taiwan.
Thank you, Ifan. And another security question, Ken, which we'll perhaps come to you on, at least first, is could the panel talk a bit more about Japan's strategic position in the US-China-Taiwan triangular relationship, and what role is it likely to play in this conflict, both militarily and economically?
Right. So any U.S. operation to defend Taiwan will go through Japan, through the American bases in Japan. There are Marines in Okinawa. They will be delivered to the battlefield by the amphibious assault ships that are based in Sasebo, Nagasaki. And then the aircraft carrier and its accompanying destroyers are all in Yokosuka, Yokohama, Kanagawa. And the Air Force is in Kadena, Okinawa, and Misawa, Aomori. So all of these assets are in Japan. So Japan will, there isn't any scenario where America will go to war over Taiwan, but Japan stays on the sidelines. Just through the presence of the bases, Japan will be very much involved, and also China would likely target those American bases in Japan, at which Japan will be involved in the war. So that is the nature. There was a question whether Japan would go to war to defend Taiwan, even if America was sitting on its hands. That is not going to happen. Japan will not go to war with China without the US. Everything will be in line with the US.
Mm. And political leaders in Japan, I mean, I mean, it's often said there's been a sort of a change in approach, and perhaps a sort of a greater kind of, well, if not willingness, then a sort of resignation that Japan is going to be somehow sort of involved at some point, and that that there's more of a sort of alarm about the perceived security threat of China. I mean, is that accurate? How does it feel at a political level in Japan from the conversations you have?
Yeah, so I think compared to 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the conversation has changed drastically. There is a recognition that China's military advancement is for real, and that Japan really has to prepare for it. At the same time, there is this thread of thinking in the Japanese Defense Ministry and the Self-Defense Force that Japan needs to be ready on its own rather than depending too much on the US. So, for instance, rather than giving the Americans a new base in Japan, the thinking is that we want to have our own self-defense force base in key locations near Taiwan, so Japan can respond itself. And also with the next generation fighters, Japan is trying now to develop its own fighter with the UK rather than buying the F-35s from America. So that's a new trend that has the potential to cause a rift between the US and Japan. Although in general, US and Japan are very tightly aligned, this feeling, and it's a right feeling, I think, that Japan shouldn't be too dependent on America could lead to tensions down the road.
Thank you, Ken. So we've only got a few minutes left. So I'd just like to ask a final sort of roundup question for you all, really related to the midterms, which is this: that have the midterms perhaps, I mean, one feature of them that we haven't seen so far, touch wood, is a large-scale denial of the results by candidates who've been defeated. I mean, of course, that can change, especially in the close races. And in one sense, of course, it's inevitable because the stakes are much lower than in a presidential election. But is there any sense, perhaps, in which these elections, whatever the final outcome, have perhaps made the US seem a slightly more stable partner than it seemed a week ago? There's sort of that there's been a slight kind of fallback of you know the wildest elements of Trumpism, and that might have a sort of impact on the way that Asian countries view the US as a partner. And then finally, just related to that, just looking forward, you know, we've talked a lot about China inevitably, but are there any other elements of the US relationship with other Asian countries that we should really watch, sort of common ground, big developments in these summits that are coming up in the next days? Ifan, do you want to start off with that one?
Sure. I think there's one, despite what's going on with the midterm, I think it's the undeniable fact that America has become a more reliable ally in the past 2 years compared to the past 4 years in the Trump terms. I think even though they're going to be midterm election deniers, the strategy the Biden administration and the Republican Party are employing right now are pretty much on the same page, is trying to unite all its allies in Asia and try to counter China's advancement. That strategy would not change regardless of the midterm results. In terms of other issues, in addition to China, I think there are several big bills that's being debated in the Congress right now, including the data privacy bill and the antitrust law bills. That's going to have a huge impact on American big techs and going to create a ripple effect on the entire tech industry in Asia as well, because all these countries are looking after in US in many ways when it's in terms of dealing with data privacy and antitrust. Also, those kind of bills is actually going to be quite interesting to look at after the midterm. Depends on the result of the midterm, because the Republican controls 2 aisles or 1 aisle going to be making a huge difference on whether those bills going to be passed or not. That's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Yvonne. Jack.
Right. I do think that is a key question here. Some of the results so far have not been so far what we know of the election. Many of the most extremely denying, election denial Republicans have failed in their races. They've not been kind to that wing of the Republican Party so far, whether that's in Congress or at the state level. And so to that point, yesterday, Biden was asked in his press conference if this was sort of a moment of Trumpism, of that kind of the fever breaking, if you will, of the MAGA kind of stranglehold on the Republican Party. And I think it's definitely too early to say, and it is an open question. But he thinks that it's maybe will become more of a minority of the party. And he harkened back to a major pitch of his since he's been in office is to allies and partners is that America is back on the world stage. And he said how before at his first G7 summit, a world leader asking, sure, America is back, but for how long? And I think that these elections absolutely kind of give him a bit more legitimacy when claiming that America is a more reliable partner going forward. Whether or not that could change in 2 years, it's hard to say. I think a major upcoming hurdle is, we talked about Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Kevin McCarthy, who's set to be speaker, has said that he would like to go to Taiwan. And if he goes to Taiwan with a delegation, it will probably be larger. It will probably be more louder than the Pelosi visit. And the Chinese reaction in kind will probably be more loud as well, maybe even more so after a more meek reaction this first time. So I think there is a real risk of both parties kind of trying to out who's harder on China each other, especially in 2024. When the election year rolls around, and that could kind of escalate tensions needlessly in the real world outside of Washington's kind of political arena.
That's a really acute point of something directly to watch as a result of the midterms. Jack, thank you for that. Ken.
Right. So a wrap up of the midterms. I was going to write a column that said both China and America have the same problem, and it's rising inequalities. And both sides have different paths to try to tackle that. In terms of Xi Jinping, we talked about common prosperity, but in America, the Trump people want to whack the system and break it all apart and then rebuild it. And it was going to be a competition between democracy versus autocracy to that same goal, and that the issue here is that the democracy is not really a representative of the people, because Fareed Zakaria was saying on CNN the other day that in solid Republican states, whatever the Democratic supporters vote means nothing. It's all about the Republican primaries. And in these Republican primaries, the more extreme you become the representative. And those mostly Trump endorsed candidates would win these primaries, and then they would come to Washington, and they would claim to have a mandate to pursue pretty radical policies. So it is democracies versus autocracies, but a very flawed democracy versus autocracy. That was what I was going to write. But the result of the midterms did not turn out to be that. These extreme candidates were voted out at the voting booth. So I think it was a good day for democracy, because I think China was preparing a press release to say if the Trump supported candidates had dominated and there was a red wave, they would have talked about how flawed the Western democratic system is, and the fact that elections alone is not true democracy. I think that's what the Chinese were preparing to say, but they can't use that talking point anymore, because the American election has proved that it has a self-correction function, and that it maintains balance, checks and balances, and the result, I think, is very good. So it was a good day for democracy and a bad day for autocracy. That was my takeaway.
Well, that's you've made the call, Ken. So let's see if it turns out that way. And thank you very much for our for everything from our really rich and distinguished panel. So much ground covered today. I'm very grateful to Ken Moriyasu, to Jack Truitt, and Yifan Yu, and really grateful also to you in the audience. Thank you very much for tuning in, and thank you very much to those of you who sent in very many stimulating questions. And I'm sorry, the ones that we didn't have time to use, but we're really grateful for you joining us, and we hope to see you at our very next Nikkei Asia online event. And in the meantime, all that remains to say is thank you for joining, and have a great day wherever you are. Take care. Bye.